It was the quiet ones. The ones who never made a sound, that held the darkest secrets. The kind of secret that could shatter everything if it was ever whispered out loud. And as the door to the old manor creaked open after years of silence, Miss Marple knew some truths were never meant to stay buried. But now, one knock, one name, would drag them all into the light, whether they were ready or not. What happens when the past comes back for you, and can you ever truly escape it? It was on a wind-swept Thursday afternoon in the second week of April, beneath a sky bruised with low-hanging clouds, that 11-year-old Thomas Fairchild, an unusually perceptive boy with a curiosity far sharper than his years, chose to take the longer forgotten path home from school. The route, once a country lane, but now little more than a memory, swallowed by weeds and whispering grass, led him behind the neglected boundaries of Blackthorn Hollow, where the fences leaned like tired sentinels, and the earth smelled of moss and secrets. There, cloaked in ivy and the weight of decades, stood the abandoned Roundtree estate, its crumbling chimneys rising like watchful eyes above tangled hedgerows. The house had once belonged to Colonel Alistair Wetherall, a war hero whose gallantry was rivaled only by his suspicion of the living. He had dwelled there alone, brooding and reclusive, until his abrupt and largely unremarked death nearly a decade ago. Since then, the manor had lingered in legal limbo, handed off from one faceless solicitor to another, until a month prior, when it was quietly let to a certain Mrs. Ellingham, a widow whose past was more rumor than record. She arrived without ceremony, and kept to herself, emerging only in the faint light of dawn or just before dusk, always clad in a coat 2 seasons too fine and gloves that never seemed to soil. Odd habits that did not go unnoticed, though were rarely spoken aloud. To Thomas, however, it was not the widow that intrigued him, but a part of the manor whispered about in playground dares and late-night tales. The eastern wing, long since thought sealed, overrun by vines that curled like skeletal fingers over brick and timber. While circling the orchard, he spotted it, an unusually narrow door half swallowed by ivy, its wood warped by time, its hinges sagging with the weight of forgotten years. Older boys had spoken of that wing, of candle flickers seen from the woods, of low groans that might have been the house settling, or not. Driven by that feverish wonderful dread only children know, Thomas approached, heart pounding with anticipation rather than fear, and gently brushed aside the green veil. The iron handle was stiff, rust-crusted and bitterly cold, but it refused to budge. Yet what unnerved him was not the locked door. It was the sound that followed, a soft, deliberate thump, then another, faint but unmistakable, like something shifting just beyond the threshold. The air stilled, even the breeze seemed to pause. Thomas froze, pulse thudding in his ears, every instinct telling him to run, but his feet rooted by that thrilling fear that comes when the imaginary inches toward the real. Silence returned, but it was not an ordinary quiet. It was the kind that listens back. Later, when he dashed home, voice breathless and face pale, his mother dismissed it as childish nonsense, and his father muttered something about squirrels. But the story had already taken root, seeding itself in the talk of the village, passed from Thomas to his friends, from friends to their parents, from neighbors to the baker, and inevitably, to the tea table of Miss Judith Maple, who sat listening with her usual calm to Mrs. Halbert's animated retelling. Not seen, but heard, Mrs. Halbert repeated, eyes bright with gossip. Behind the east wing door, the one choked in ivy, Miss Maple, whose mind missed little and dismissed even less, stirred her tea slowly, her expression unreadable, though her thoughts were already drifting elsewhere. That phrase had triggered something, a memory long buried. She recalled the Colonel's icy disdain for company, his outright refusal to attend the harvest social, his comments about spiritual interference with inheritance laws, and she remembered too the eastern wing, once the nursery, later sealed shut after a quiet tragedy that was never officially spoken of, but whispered about by nannies and groundskeepers. Mrs. Ellingham, she mused, had claimed no familial ties, yet wore a brooch unmistakably Roundtree in origin. A coincidence perhaps, but Judith Maple did not believe in coincidences. As the clock ticked gently on the mantel and the fire cracked low, she did not look to her guest or the window. Her eyes remained on her cup, but her mind was elsewhere, back at that ivy-covered door, where something had stirred after years of silence, not violently, not loudly, but deliberately, and just once, as though acknowledging that it had been found. In the quiet village of St. Mary's, where time seemed to stretch with the unhurried flow of the seasons, a peculiar event had begun to stir the local rumour mill. It wasn't the arrival of a new tenant that caught the villagers' attention, but the unsettling silence that followed. Mrs. Evelyn Draycott, a widow with a sharp mind and a guarded presence, arrived at the ancient Blackthorn Manor in late winter, a time when the trees still held the memory of last year's frost, and the village seemed to hum with a strange anticipatory quiet. She came alone, in a nondescript car, her movements measured and deliberate, as though she carried some unspoken weight. Her letters to the estate's lawyer had been simple, efficient, and devoid of any personal detail. Yet the arrangement was perfect, leaving no room for suspicion. The villagers noticed her methodical ways, the sharp lines of her grey coat, the tightly wound bun at the back of her head, and her ever-present black gloves. Nothing about her seemed out of place, yet everything about her presence felt wrong. It was not her reserved nature that caused the whispers, but the strange decisions she made regarding the property. The house, which had long been a fixture of local folklore, had stood empty since the death of Colonel Ambrose Ashford, an enigmatic man, whose sudden passing was still remembered with a certain discomfort. The grand estate, once a symbol of wealth and history, had become a shadow of its former self, its halls echoing with the silence of forgotten memories. Yet Mrs. Draycott, upon moving in, had refused to open the entire house. The western wing, long since shut off from the rest of the manor, remained untouched. When a local farmer's wife had politely asked if she intended to make use of the full house, Mrs. Draycott's reply was terse, a smile barely brushing her lips as she said, "There is enough space here as it stands." Yet the house was large, far too large for a single woman, and there was an air of unreality about the way she had arrived. No moving van, no family to speak of, just 2 trunks delivered by train. An unusual manner of settling into such a vast and imposing house. Her pantry, when seen from the village window, contained no fresh produce, only dry goods, canned foods, and odd bottles of imported herbs. The house, however, held its own secrets. The eastern wing, the one thought to be sealed for good, held a door that had not been opened in decades. A door that no one dared approach, even in passing. The villagers spoke of it only in hushed tones, mentioning the inexplicable cold drafts that sometimes escaped from the cracked windows, and the odd sounds that emanated from the eastern side of the manor at night. It was said that on clear nights the sound of a piano could be heard faintly drifting from that wing, though no one had ever seen anyone enter or leave. But it was Miss Judith Marlowe, the village's unofficial historian and observer of all things strange, who first began to sense that something was not right. She had on occasion seen Mrs. Draycott standing by the window in that very wing, staring not at the house, but at the thick overgrowth that had once been a garden, her gaze locked on something hidden deep within the tangled vines. There was no attempt to clear the weeds, no care for the neglected grounds, only an odd fixation on the neglected garden that gave Miss Marlowe a chill. She knew, instinctively, that something more than mere coincidence was at play. Why would someone, having moved into such a grand house, not seek to open the entire estate? She murmured to herself one evening, sipping her tea in the small, quiet comfort of her study. Her mind raced, circling back to the peculiarities. Mrs. Draycott's cold exterior, her solitary nature, and the eerie silence surrounding the locked wing. She was a woman who had chosen to live in a house with a locked door, and though no one had dared to question her about it, Miss Marlowe's instincts told her that it was no simple matter of personal preference. It was something far deeper, and as the days drew on, with the bitter winds of early spring giving way to a tentative thaw, the strange quiet of Blackthorn Manor began to press upon the village more and more. It was as if the house itself was waiting for something or someone, and Mrs. Draycott was merely the vessel. The tension in the village grew palpable, a low hum of anxiety that permeated every conversation, every glance cast toward the estate. And when a local child, Thomas Radcliffe, reported seeing the curtains in the eastern wing twitch on a night when no one was supposed to be inside, the air grew thicker still. It was now only a matter of time before the mysteries of Blackthorn Manor began to unravel, and Miss Marlowe, with her sharp mind and quiet persistence, would be at the center of it all, piecing together the dark, buried history of a house that had never truly let go of its past. The village of St. Mary's, a tranquil hamlet nestled deep in the countryside, had always been a place where time meandered like a lazy river, its current slow but steady, and where the most significant events were those that anchored the seasons, the first snow, the harvest, and of course the annual church fete. Held each spring beneath a line of weather-beaten canvas tents, it was more of a social gathering than anything else. No one expected anything earth-shattering, no grand revelations, no profound moments, just a series of pleasant exchanges, a few games, and the chance to briefly escape the routine of everyday life. But this year, there was an undercurrent of something different, something subtle but persistent, that rippled just beneath the surface. Mrs. Sandringham, with her reserved elegance, became the focus of it all. Her presence was felt before it was even acknowledged. She moved through the tables, her every gesture steeped in quiet dignity, the faintest smile curling her lips as she interacted with the women of the village. She donated a fruitcake to the raffle, an unassuming gesture, and purchased a small bouquet from the Women's Guild stall, her hands careful as she handled the change, never fully removing her gloves, as if to shield herself from the world. The whispers began almost immediately, traveling faster than a summer wind, each person adding a bit more to the story. Some claimed she had been a nurse during the war, tending to officers in a distant hospital in Bath. Others were more dramatic, suggesting she had once been engaged to a man who perished at Dunkirk, a love lost in the tragedy of war. Still, others insisted, with a confidence that only came from years of gossip, that she was a distant relative of Major Calthorpe, whose untimely death had left Finchley Farm abandoned and shrouded in mystery. But Miss Marple, who never missed the subtleties of human behavior, paid little attention to these rumors. She had learned long ago that truth rarely emerged from the mouths of the villagers, especially when it was wrapped in the soft fabric of speculation. No, Miss Marple's attention was trained on the finer details, the little things that others often overlooked. She noticed how Mrs. Sandringham never removed her gloves, even when handling the coins for her purchase. She observed the faint hesitation in the lady's voice when the vicar's wife offered her a slice of cake, and how she politely declined, citing a delicate digestion. But Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the deeper aversion beneath the words. These were not signs of simple discomfort, but of something far more calculated, more intentional. Mrs. Sandringham's clothing, too, told a quiet but unmistakable story. It was clear that her wardrobe was well made, of fine material, but it bore the marks of alteration. The hem of her skirt was clearly let down, and the seams of her coat were tailored to conceal, to hide rather than to enhance. She wore no jewelry, save for a thin chain at her neck, which seemed to disappear beneath the fabric of her blouse, a curious choice for a woman of her apparent social standing. But the most telling moment, the one that truly caught Miss Marple's attention, came when a village boy, in the innocent way of children, mentioned the funny old wing of Finchley Farm, the one with the locked door. For just a brief instant, Mrs. Sandringham's expression froze, her face betraying an emotion so fleeting, so subtle, that only someone with Miss Marple's acute powers of observation could have caught it. It wasn't the stillness of forgetfulness or confusion, it was the stillness of someone who had been asked a question for which they had no intention of answering, a stillness that spoke volumes in its silence. Later that afternoon, over tea with her longtime friend Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple reflected on the strange atmosphere at the church fete. "You know, it was rather enlightening, wasn't it?" she remarked, her tone soft, though her eyes gleamed with the spark of insight. "Everyone's been asking the wrong questions. No one seems to wonder why a woman of Mrs. Sandringham's background, with no apparent ties to the village, would choose to live alone in a place like Finchley Farm, especially a house so clearly neglected, so clearly hiding something. And why, I wonder, does she keep half of it locked away? Mrs. Weatherby, who was not quite as accustomed to Miss Marple's methodical observations, merely nodded, sensing that her friend was onto something, though unsure of just what. It was during the weekly market, a time for the exchange of eggs, gossip, and the occasional bit of small talk about the weather, that the next thread of the puzzle began to surface. Mrs. Petherick, a woman who had lived in the village for many years, and whose knowledge of local goings-on was rivaled only by her practical nature, was the one to unwittingly add another piece to the mystery. As she weighed a bundle of spring onions, she mentioned almost casually the fate of Finchley Farm. "I dare say it's good someone's taken the place," she said, her voice steady, but laced with a quiet wariness. "Though my George says she'll never open the east wing. Not after what he was asked to do." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the words, and though she said nothing, she could feel the puzzle pieces begin to click into place. Mrs. Petherick, sensing she had said something of interest, quickly added, "Oh, I shouldn't speak of it. It's years ago now. George wouldn't say a word at the time, but Major Calthorpe was very clear about that, not a word. And he paid well enough. But it's troubled him, you know, Jane especially now that the place is let." The more Miss Marple listened, the more the air around Finchley Farm seemed to thicken with unspoken history, with shadows that had yet to be fully acknowledged. There was something far darker beneath the surface, something hidden in the locked east wing, and she had the distinct feeling that Mrs. Sandringham knew far more than she was letting on. The conversation was just a beginning, a whisper of the secrets that lay buried in the dust of Finchley Farm, and Miss Marple could already sense the storm brewing, its winds silent but relentless, ready to sweep through the village and uncover everything it had been hiding for so long. Finchley Farm, the great, crumbling house on the edge of St. Mary's Head, had always been a place of quiet mystery, with whispers trailing its shadow like the ivy creeping up its stone walls. On one particularly bitter winter evening, George, the village carpenter, had returned from there later than expected, pale and unusually quiet, his usual affable demeanor replaced by a disquiet that seemed to cling to him like the frost on his coat. He had been instructed, so he said, to reinforce a door in the east wing, not with the usual bolts or locks, but with thick planks, heavy and deliberate, nailed crosswise over the entry. There was no explanation beyond that, only the stern command of Major Calthorpe, who had insisted that no one venture beyond the door, not for any reason. The room beyond, George was told, was to remain untouched. It wasn't the kind of task one usually expected of the village carpenter, and it troubled George, though he was never the type to question orders. He had returned that night, shaken but silent, only mentioning that the room was far from what one would expect in an abandoned wing. It was furnished, lived in, not neglected or forgotten. And yet, there was something about it, something that made him feel that, despite the stillness, it had never truly been empty. Miss Marple, whose mind never rested on such matters, leaned in close as she listened. "And what did George say was in the room?" she asked, her voice soft yet purposeful, the kind of voice that invited more than just the surface of an answer. "He never said," replied Mrs. Petherick, lowering her voice instinctively, as if the very act of speaking it aloud could release something dangerous. "Only that it felt wrong, like it was waiting for something." There was a pause, thick with unspoken truths, and Miss Marple could feel the puzzle pieces slipping together in her mind, the picture slowly becoming clearer. Boarding up a room in such a way was not an act of practicality. It was a manifestation of fear, fear of something unknown, something hidden, and Miss Marple knew, with an unsettling certainty, that it was never fear that held the truth. That evening, as she sat by her window, her knitting needle clicking rhythmically, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted not to Mrs. Sandringham, who had stirred the quiet village with her mysterious presence, nor to the odd tales of the door that echoed with a sound it should not have made. No, her mind was far more occupied with the late Major Calthorpe, long dead, yet still looming over the estate like a spectre, guarding a secret that had been sealed for far too long. It was as though the house itself had breathed its last sigh, and was now waiting for someone, or something to uncover the story that had been buried beneath its walls. She had never considered herself a busybody, despite the village's reputation for gossip, but she did hold a deep belief in the quiet power of observation, and she knew that when a mystery called, it was a call not to be ignored. The next morning, as she passed Mr. Giles Mercer's modest solicitor's office, freshly polished and eerily quiet, Miss Marple could not resist the pull of curiosity. She was, after all, only asking after a charity bequest, a perfectly reasonable excuse for a brief casual conversation. It was then, quite by chance, that she heard the name of Elenina Hartley, a name she had not thought of in years. "Oh yes, Elenina," Mr. Mercer had said offhandedly, distracted by the details of her inquiry. "She worked at Finchley Farm some time ago, a companion, or a housekeeper, I believe. She disappeared, just before the Major fell ill. Never heard from her again." That was all. But Miss Marple's mind stirred with the name, her memory sharpening like a blade. Elenina Hartley had been a tall woman, graceful, with dark braided hair coiled at the back of her head like a crown. She had arrived during the war under mysterious terms, and then, without any fanfare, simply disappeared. The explanation had been vague, something about a nervous breakdown, and she had supposedly gone to a home in Devon to recuperate. No forwarding address, no word since. It was not uncommon for such women to fade into obscurity, but Miss Marple knew better than most that some absences were louder than any presence. She recalled the locked room in the east wing, that door that had remained untouched, not just closed but sealed, as though the house itself were determined to keep whatever lay beyond it hidden. And then there was the boy, Toby, whose innocent mention of hearing strange sounds from that very door had struck a chord deep within her. Could it be, Miss Marple wondered, that the room had once belonged to Elenina, and if so, had it ever truly been abandoned? The thought clung to her like the mist that rolled in from the moors, thick and creeping. Could it be that some things, once locked away, never truly stayed sealed? And if Elenina Hartley had vanished without a trace, what dark forgotten history had she left behind in that room? The question gnawed at Miss Marple, pulling her thoughts back to the farm, back to the haunting silence that had once been the Major's, and now perhaps belonged to someone, or something else entirely. A mystery had been buried long ago, and it was time for it to breathe again. The evening air was thick with the heavy scent of something once cherished but now forgotten, a presence that clung stubbornly to the past, refusing to be shaken off. Miss Marple sat in her favorite chair by the window, the low light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the room as she mulled over the recent happenings at Finchley Farm. Her mind, ever alert to the smallest details, found itself drawn deeper into a mystery that seemed to grow with every passing hour. It was almost as if the past, long sealed away, had been waiting for the right moment to reawaken, to come rushing back with a force that could not be ignored. The conversation she'd had earlier in the day replayed in her mind. It hadn't started with Finchley Farm. No, it had been a casual exchange about the goings-on in the village, but one word, one mention of a name, had set her thoughts racing. The voices, loud, angry, echoing across the orchard, drifting on the cold winter air. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect to hear on an estate as quiet and seemingly benign as the Calthorpe house. No, these were voices that spoke of conflict, of something far darker than the usual domestic disagreements. And the more Miss Marple listened, the more she realized that the whispers she'd heard were not the idle chatter of the village, but the warning bells of something far more serious. Mrs. Little, who kept a modest flock of hens on the edge of Finchley's boundary, had been the first to confirm it. She'd heard the shouting too. She'd heard it every evening, sharp and cutting through the silence, the sound of doors slamming, voices that cared little for who heard them. And then there was Miss Paring, the retired schoolteacher with her sharp eyes and her penchant for routine. She too had noticed something amiss, having passed the gate twice and heard the unmistakable sound of arguing, the kind that unsettled the air. But it was the second time, the time when she swore she had heard crying, dreadful, desperate sobs that could never be mistaken for the innocent weeping of a person grieving. No, this was something far more harrowing, the sound of a soul caught in some private torment, knowing that their cries were meant to remain unheard. It painted a picture far from the serene, undisturbed life that had been presented to the world. The picture of a man at the end of his life, alone in his house, peacefully passing away in the quiet of his home. But the truth, as Miss Marple knew all too well, was rarely so simple. She continued to piece together the fragments of the story, each new detail casting a shadow over what she thought she knew. The war had taken so many men from their homes, yet Finchley Farm had remained inhabited, though not bustling. There had been deliveries, glimpses of a nurse or companion, and occasional visitors, whose names were never recorded in any public registers. It was all enough to raise suspicion, enough to warrant a closer look, but none of it seemed like cause for alarm, at least not until now. Now, with the house reopened, and the whispers revived by young Toby's tale of strange knocks from behind a locked door, Miss Marple began to see it all unfold before her, like a tapestry that had been hidden away for too long. She had thought of Eleanor Hartley, such a peculiar name, one she'd overheard in passing conversation with Mr. Mercer. Eleanor had worked at Finchley Farm years ago, a housekeeper or companion to the Major. She had vanished just before the Major fell ill, her departure explained away as a nervous breakdown. No one had ever followed up. No one had asked questions. It was a story that had been accepted at face value, and that, Miss Marple knew, was always where the truth began to slip through the cracks. There had been no forwarding address, no evidence that Eleanor had ever recovered. In fact, no one had heard from her again. Miss Marple's suspicions began to take root. There was more to this than met the eye. The locked room, the sealed door, and the absence of any credible record of Eleanor's departure. These weren't isolated, insignificant details. They were part of a pattern, a thread that could lead her deeper into a mystery that had been carefully concealed behind silence. Silence was often the best friend of secrets. Miss Marple knew. It could be cultivated, protected, even cherished by those who needed to bury something far darker than grief or sorrow. The silence surrounding Finchley Farm had been thick with it for years, and now, with the house once again under scrutiny, that silence began to tremble with the weight of things long hidden. She found herself revisiting the parish lending library, as she often did, more out of habit than necessity. The library, tucked away in the back of the church hall, was her refuge. She didn't care much for the selection, which was mostly filled with books on moral improvement, but it offered a certain peace, a chance to slip into the background, and observe the comings and goings of the village. Mrs. Renfrew, the part-time librarian, was always present, offering polite smiles and stilted conversation. But it was on this particular visit, as she handed over a worn copy of Mansfield Park, that Miss Marple's attention was caught by something unexpected. A book she hadn't borrowed in years, The Garden and the Mind, caught her eye. It was an odd little volume, filled with essays on the therapeutic benefits of horticulture, its pages yellowed, and its spine cracked, with a faint dried petal scent lingering within. The book had been donated long ago by a forgotten patron, but it was the kind of book that Miss Marple knew would hold secrets. Secrets that had been waiting for the right moment to surface. She reached for it, the familiar weight of the book in her hands, a sense of quiet inevitability settling over her. Perhaps it was no coincidence that she had found it now, at this very moment, when everything seemed to be pulling her back to Finchley. Perhaps, like the garden it spoke of, the mind had its own way of cultivating thoughts, of keeping things hidden beneath the surface until the right time. The faint rustle of its pages as she opened it seemed to whisper the same truth she had long known. Some secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, could never stay buried forever. And now it seemed, it was time for those secrets to bloom once again. The old book creaked open with the kind of familiarity reserved for forgotten things, its pages settling not at the beginning, but somewhere in the midst of a story that had been tucked away, unnoticed, for decades. The paper, thin and yellowed with age, seemed to hold secrets between its folds, and Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, did not rush to pull it free. She studied it for a long moment, allowing the quiet, respectful pause that such discoveries demanded. The letter, unsigned but bearing the delicate initials, E.S. in the corner, was written in an elegant hand. The ink faded but still legible. It read, "If anything happens, it will be because he knows. Not because I told him, but because he always knew. The door is only locked on one side. He thinks I am too frightened to leave. But I am not anymore." The letter was dated 1948, a year that hung heavy with significance. The time just before Major Culthorpe's death, and years after Eleanor Hartley had supposedly vanished. The words weren't rushed or frantic. There was a clarity to them, a calmness that spoke of someone who had long understood their fate. The phrase, "The door is only locked on one side," lingered in Miss Marple's mind, the repetition of it almost like an echo of a deeper truth. It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a real physical lock, a trap designed not by force, but by manipulation, by the steady corrosion of fear. Someone, it seemed, had wanted the world to believe Eleanor had simply disappeared. But in reality, she had been hidden away, her life a silent prisoner behind ivy-covered walls, and a door whose key had long been lost. The initials EH, though confirming her suspicions, still sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. It was clear now that the east wing of Finchley Farm had once been hers. Perhaps it still was, in ways that no one had dared to acknowledge. The house had kept her there, quietly, for all these years, just as it had kept its secrets. But it was inevitable, as always, that the past would resurface, disturbed not by careful investigations, but by the recklessness of youth. Peter Lomax, barely 13, and with a heart full of rebellious daring, accepted the dare that had been passed to him in whispered rumors. The stories had spread among the village boys like wildfire. The tales of a mysterious door on Finchley Farm, a door no one dared approach. There were whispers of lights flickering behind the vines at dusk, of the handle shifting ever so slightly when touched, of something waiting beyond. It was all nonsense, of course, or so they told themselves. But, as with all nonsense, it had the power to ignite something within them, a desire to prove themselves braver than the others, to confirm that their fears were nothing more than childish superstition. Peter waited until the sun had set, casting long shadows over the landscape. It was the hour when the world felt uncertain, when every rustle of the wind and every creak of the trees seemed to speak in hushed tones of what was yet to come. He approached the door, his hand steady though his pulse quickened with the thrill of it. The ivy tangled around the old wooden frame like a lover's embrace, but it gave way easily, as though it too had grown tired of hiding. The latch resisted, creaking under his grip, but with a quiet groan, the door shifted inward, the wood parting reluctantly from its frame. What lay beyond was not the darkness Peter had expected, but a stillness so profound. It felt as though time itself had ceased to move. Stepping inside, his heart thundered, not from fear, but from a quiet recognition. Something had happened here, something final and unspoken. The room was untouched, its furniture covered in dust, as if waiting for someone who would never return. In the far corner, a figure lay motionless on a chaise, a silent reminder of the past that could not be erased. Peter's breath caught in his throat as an overwhelming sense of wrongness gripped him. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of years of silence, pushing him back as though the room itself was unwilling to allow him to stay. Before his legs could carry him further, he was already retreating, his instincts screaming at him to leave before something, anything, could reveal itself. When he finally emerged, his face was pale, drained of the defiance that had been there just moments before. He spoke no words, but his eyes said everything. His father, alarmed by the change in him, wasted no time in questioning the boy, but Peter's answers were vague, only further deepening the mystery. There had been something in that room, something not meant to be seen, something that had been waiting for someone brave enough to open the door. But now, as the weight of what he had uncovered began to sink in, Peter realized he had opened a door that might never be closed again. The secrets that had been buried so deeply in the quiet corners of Finchley Farm were no longer safe, and Miss Marple, who had always known that some things could never remain hidden forever, felt the stirrings of a puzzle that was now too urgent to ignore. Something had begun to unravel, and she would not rest until every last thread was pulled into the light. The moment the door creaked open, the air within the long-forgotten East Wing seemed to stir with something far older than time itself, as if it were reacting to the intrusion of the outside world. It was not an ordinary silence that greeted the officers and Miss Marple, but a profound stillness that clung to the air like a forgotten secret, wrapping the room in a layer of tension that refused to dissipate. The furniture, once neatly arranged, stood untouched by dust, as though time had paused its relentless march in this small forgotten corner of the estate. A small wooden desk sat in the corner, a half-finished glass of water resting on its surface, untouched by the years of abandonment. Yet, despite its perfect preservation, the room was undeniably empty. The faintest smell lingered in the air, something almost sweet, a forgotten fragrance that whispered of long-past days, perhaps lavender, or the lingering trace of perfume once worn by someone who had walked through this room with purpose. But it was what lay upon the faintly draped chair that caused the most unsettling stir. A figure, carefully placed, as if she had been set there for eternity. Her withered form was draped in a once ornate shawl, now faded by years of neglect. Her hands, delicate but skeletal, clutched a silver locket, the metal tarnished with age, its surface worn smooth by the passage of time. Inside, the photograph was barely visible, a ghostly image of someone who could have been lost in the folds of memory. Yet, the initials EH barely etched into the locket's back were unmistakable. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She only studied the scene with quiet interest, her mind whirring as she pieced together the tangled history laid out before her. Mrs. Sandringham, summoned to identify the body, paled the moment she saw the locket, her composure faltering for just a breath before she stiffened, her face tightening into a mask of recognition. The faint scent of roses and jasmine, still lingering in the air, caught Miss Marple's attention. It was more than a scent. It was a whisper of the past, of lives long lost, of a time sealed away, behind layers of dust and silence. Miss Marple, ever the observer, did not react as the others did, but rather, her gaze sharpened. She knew grief well, but it was not the grief of the woman before her that struck her most. It was the recognition, the chilling understanding that the secrets of the past had been carefully preserved, hidden behind the veil of a long-forgotten life. The body was a clue, but it was the silence surrounding it that spoke volumes. The room, now a tomb to a lost soul, was filled with more than just dust. It was filled with a truth that had been buried, locked away in the most unlikely of places. And now, it was impossible to ignore. The key had always been there, waiting, and now it was only a matter of time before everything came undone. Miss Marple knew it. She could feel it in the air, in the scent of the flowers that had long since withered, in the silence that held the room captive. The past had a way of creeping forward, sometimes when you least expected it. And now, it was here, ready to reveal its long-buried secrets. The scent was subtle yet powerful, hanging in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. It was a mixture of rosewater and jasmine, not the kind sold in any modern store, but a delicate combination that had once been cherished by a particular kind of woman. Those who believed that true elegance lay in the ability to leave a lasting impression without uttering a word. It was a fragrance from another time, from an era when the power of scent was not to attract but to remember, to be soft and memorable in ways that went unnoticed by most. Miss Marple had encountered it before, many years ago, at the christening of a neighbor's child, worn by a lady who had kept her gloves on even as she smiled, her gestures always measured, deliberate. It was a scent of memory, not of youth or fleeting fashion, but of someone who understood the quiet art of lingering in one's thoughts long after they had gone. This scent, forgotten by the world, had endured. It had not decayed with time, nor had it drifted far from where it had first been worn. Now, in this very room, it clung to the air like an unspoken secret, one that had not faded with the years, one that had survived both the hands of time and the fading of those who once wore it. Mrs. Sandringham, so poised and elegant, had worn something nearly identical when Miss Marple first met her. Perhaps a coincidence, but in St. Mary's coincidences were as rare as truth. In the realm of women's fragrances, there was always meaning, and Miss Marple trusted her instincts. There was something here, something woven into the fabric of the room, something that had been set in motion long before she had arrived. The room itself had been arranged with the kind of precision that suggested more than just a passing moment of death. No, this had been a room that had been prepared, cared for, made ready, not for discovery, but for something else entirely. The tea tray so carefully placed at the left of the chair, who would place it there? Why not the right, the natural side for a right-handed person? This small, seemingly insignificant detail struck Miss Marple, who had observed such things for decades. The cup, too, was suspicious, wiped clean, empty, but untouched by time. A cup used just moments before death, surely it would have traces, perhaps a mark left from a sip taken in the last moments of life. And yet, it had been wiped clean, no trace of its former contents remaining. It was as though everything in the room had been arranged with the careful formality of a burial, a ritual of sorts, made not in haste, but with deliberation. Every detail spoke of someone who had tidied the room with a purpose, who had placed the body and the objects with intent. This was not the chaos of discovery, but the quiet, controlled hand of someone who intended for this room, this scene, to remain undisturbed. The death of Eleanor Hartley was not an accident. It was an event, an orchestrated moment, one that had been planned long before the fatal end. Miss Marple, standing in the doorway, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, felt the stirrings of something larger unfolding. She left the room quietly, as she had entered, without comment, but her mind was far from still. There were too many unanswered questions, and the answers, she knew, lay hidden in the shadows of the past. A woman had died here, behind a locked door, but it wasn't the lock that kept her confined. It was the walls themselves, the walls built by those who had wished her to stay where she was, buried and forgotten. And there was something else that tugged at Miss Marple's thoughts, a memory long dormant. The estate, Major Calthorpe's estate, had been passed not to a distant cousin, but to the first wife of the Major, Eleanor. Why had no one mentioned it? Why had it been erased from history? Miss Marple knew, with certainty, that such things rarely happened by chance. Wherever silence gathers, she had learned, wealth is never far behind. The death of Eleanor Hartley had not simply marked the end of a life, it had erased a claim to an estate that could have changed everything. This was not just a death, it was a quiet, deliberate act to erase the very existence of a person whose claim to the property could not be allowed to stand. After the discovery at Finchley Farm, the village had fallen into a quiet buzz of curiosity. It was not the kind of gossip that would make headlines, but it was persistent, a hum beneath the surface that could not be ignored. Who was she? Why had no one looked for her? Why had Major Calthorpe said nothing? But Miss Marple's questions were not about the body, not about the tragic end of a woman who had been forgotten by the world. No, Miss Marple's thoughts were focused elsewhere, on the things that remained hidden, the things that had been carefully covered up. She spoke to Mr. Giles Mercer, the lawyer, not with accusations, but with soft probing questions phrased in the language of concern. She had learned over the years that people, especially those in positions like Mr. Mercer's, could be more revealing when they were not threatened. And Mr. Mercer, though kind, could not hide his discomfort. He confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected: an inheritance had once been in question, and Major Calthorpe's first wife, Eleanor, had disappeared under the guise of mental instability. No separation had been recorded, no death certificate issued, just a long, eerie silence that had allowed the estate to pass to a niece after Major Calthorpe's death. It seemed almost too neat, too convenient. Miss Marple's mind clicked into place as she considered the legal phrasing of the documents. Legal assumptions, she knew, were not made without quiet encouragement. The pieces fit too perfectly, too deliberately, and Miss Marple's memory stirred once more, bringing her back to Nurse Hardwick, a name mentioned years ago in passing, a woman who had worked at a clinic near Cheltenham. A patient had arrived under a different name, but with a ring bearing the engraving EH. At the time it had seemed strange, but now it seemed more than a coincidence. It was a thread, waiting to be unraveled. Miss Marple knew that in matters of mystery, the smallest detail could often be the key that unlocked everything. The past had a way of resurfacing, and when it did, the truth would not be silenced for long. The silence in St. Mary's had always been its most defining feature, a quietude that stretched like an ancient cobweb, delicate yet impenetrable. But now, a crack had appeared, a small fissure that would soon send ripples through its carefully maintained serenity. The discovery of a body, long forgotten, was not just an event, it was the unveiling of a secret, buried beneath layers of time, deceit, and silence. Miss Marple's mind, always attuned to the smallest disturbances, felt the stirrings of a pattern. What if Eleanor Hartley had never truly vanished? What if her disappearance had been a calculated act, not of death, but of erasure? What if in the quiet recesses of her mind, she had known that her rights to the estate were far from settled, and had returned, quietly, to reclaim what was rightfully hers? The locket, the locked door, the faint trace of jasmine lingering in the air, it all pointed to something more than just a tragic end. There had been no struggle, because there had been no need for one. A single, calming drink, a soft-spoken promise to rest, and the closing of a door, both physical and metaphorical. No violence, no outbursts, just a quiet, deliberate act to ensure that the past remained undisturbed. The silence, once broken, could never be put back into place. As the garden began to bloom anew, so too would the tangled roots of history, once disturbed, never return to their original form. The village buzzed with speculation. St. Mary's, always so genteel, now found itself woven into a web of whispered intrigue. The initials EH were passed from one neighbor to another, each with their own theory, each with their own version of the past. The major, once seen as a stoic, reserved man, was now the subject of revisionist history. His war service, once a mark of honor, had become the backdrop to a darker narrative, one of hidden tempers and unspoken resentments. And Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, allowed the rumors to wash over her like a passing mist, never reacting, never forcing a response. She knew better than anyone that the truth had a way of making itself known without any help from her. It was only a matter of waiting for the right moment, the right clue. Her attention had already narrowed to a small circle of individuals, people whose lives had been touched by Finchley Farm long before the body had been found. Mrs. Sandringham, whose every action seemed designed to be as perfect and controlled as her garden. Mr. Giles Mercer, the solicitor with a memory that seemed conveniently selective. Reverend Pike, whose vague references to a time of spiritual distress had only served to spark more questions than answers. And even Agnes, the housemaid turned cleaner, whose petty thefts had been noted but whose true sin, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in her dishonesty, but in her proximity to the heart of the mystery. None of these people were villains in the conventional sense. They were simply ordinary individuals, drawn into a story much larger than they had realized. A story that had remained hidden, locked away behind doors, both literal and metaphorical. And now that those doors were opening again, Miss Marple could sense the subtle shifts in each of them, as if memories long buried were beginning to surface. These were the echoes of guilt, quiet and persistent, that could never be fully erased. The casual observer might have seen Miss Marple's days as unremarkable. Tea with friends, parish meetings, routine errands. But beneath the surface of these ordinary activities, her mind was working, quietly weaving together the threads of a story only she could see. It was in the post office that the first crack appeared, the first inconsistency that would set the entire puzzle into motion. A seemingly innocent interaction, a word, a glance, but for Miss Marple, it was enough. Every detail, every whisper, every gesture, was another clue, another piece of the mystery that had already begun to unravel. The truth, she knew, was out there, hiding in plain sight, and it would not remain hidden for much longer. While collecting a seemingly innocuous parcel for her grandniece, Miss Meredith Whitlow, an observant woman known for her polite smile and deceptively quiet manner, offhandedly remarked upon the curious frequency of letters recently arriving for Mrs. Clarissa Hawthorne. All bore the same elegant script and hailed from a London address. The postmistress, ever eager to prove helpful, revealed without hesitation that these letters had not only been frequent, but dated back to several months before Mrs. Hawthorne had officially taken residence at Briar Hollow. "We forwarded them to a guest house in Devon," she added cheerfully. She said she was finalizing matters before settling in. Miss Whitlow did not appear shocked, but inwardly the revelation fastened itself like a puzzle piece finding its place. Just weeks ago, at the Garden Club fete, Mrs. Hawthorne had calmly claimed she'd never heard of the previous tenant, Colonel Abernathy, before signing the lease. If that were true, why then had a steady stream of correspondence preceded her? And more importantly, with whom had she been exchanging letters from a house she supposedly had no connection to? Days later, over tea with Mrs. Delaney, who enjoyed gossip only marginally more than embroidery, another thread pulled taut. Mrs. Hawthorne had casually mentioned wintering in Corsica. But when Miss Whitlow softly commented that the Mediterranean air must have been warmer than that of Scarborough, a momentary flicker crossed Clarissa's face, an almost imperceptible hitch, not of memory faltering, but of story building gone momentarily awry. Miss Whitlow had seen such slips before, in grieving widows pretending not to grieve, in men bluffing regret, in children trained too young to lie well. Clarissa wasn't confused. She was correcting her script, and she wasn't the only one unraveling at the edges. Mr. Alcott, the family solicitor, seemed overly insistent that Colonel Abernathy's affairs had been entirely above board, as though answering questions not yet posed. Young Emily, the maid at the vicarage who had once worked at Briar Hollow, had recently begun avoiding Miss Whitlow's gaze altogether, especially when any mention of the East Wing came up. Even Reverend Falk, typically unshakable in tone and scripture, had been heard mumbling something about penance cloaked in propriety, after Sunday's sermon. But it was the roses that finally began to speak. Miss Whitlow had long believed that gardens, when left untamed, often told truths their owners buried. She referred to them as nature's diary, written in roots and petals. And now, weeks after the rediscovery of a woman's remains in the shuttered east chamber, believed to be that of Eleanor Blackmore, a woman long thought lost to sea, Mrs. Hawthorne had withdrawn completely from village life. The house, once immaculate, showed signs of fatigue, except for one peculiar spot, a narrow flower bed behind the servants' entrance, tended with such obsessive care that it looked like an altar. Under the guise of dropping wool for the parish drive, Miss Whitlow visited Briar Hollow, and was met not by the mistress, but by a pale maid whose hands trembled as she received the basket. "Mrs. Hawthorne is resting," she stammered. "She's not been herself since." She didn't finish the sentence. As Miss Whitlow turned to go, she asked casually, "Do the roses still bloom behind the kitchen door?" The girl, caught off guard, nodded before catching herself. "She tends those herself," she whispered, as if confessing a secret. "No one else is allowed." That afternoon, from the back lane, Miss Whitlow observed the garden from behind the hedge. The rosebushes were blood red, far too exotic for the region, and nestled among them was a single leafy sprout not yet in bloom, but unmistakably familiar. Weeks ago, she had pressed an identical leaf between the pages of her diary, one she had found inside a locket, clutched in the hand of the long-dead woman discovered beneath the east wing floorboards. It wasn't just a flower, it was a conatum, wolfsbane, lethal, ancient and legal only in trace amounts. And in that moment, Miss Whitlow knew with absolute clarity, someone had been preparing for Eleanor's return long before she arrived, and someone else had made sure she would never be able to leave again. Auntie Zera, a woman known for her unblinking intuition and sharp observation, had gone to the post office on what seemed like an ordinary day, simply to collect a small parcel. But her eyes lingered a little too long on a familiar name, Farida Bukhari, a name that stirred something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite explain. Every week, there came a letter addressed to Farida, always with the same handwriting, always postmarked from Lahore. The oddity was, These letters had been arriving long before Farida ever set foot in Darak Haveli. At first, Sarah dismissed it as a clerical error, or mere coincidence, but there was something unsettling about the rhythm of these letters, their quiet consistency, like a heartbeat hiding behind the walls. One evening, over a casual cup of tea, Sarah tried to probe gently, asking Farida if she'd ever been to Murray. Her answer was smooth, rehearsed, too polished, like someone who had practiced each syllable in front of a mirror. Her hands trembled slightly, eyes flicking away too quickly, and she claimed to have no interest in gardening, which struck Sarah as strange given how often Farida was seen tending to the garden's far corner, beyond the main path. But the real storm came on a quiet afternoon, when Sarah returned to Darak Haveli, under the pretense of returning a misplaced shawl. Taking the long way around, she passed through the back kitchen and out into the garden. There, tucked behind a narrow trellis and a tangle of neglected bushes, was a single plot, neatly maintained, the soil soft and recently turned, and blooming in that hidden patch were jasmine flowers, pale and fragrant despite the encroaching decay around them. A young maid, barely glancing up, murmured, "Only Farida Baji goes there. She doesn't let anyone else touch it." Jasmine, delicate, haunting and eerily familiar. It was the same flower Sarah had once seen pressed between the velvet lining of an old cushion inside a silver locket, a locket that had belonged to the judge's wife, the very woman who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances decades ago, and was presumed dead or worse. Jasmine wasn't just a flower, it was a signature, a memory buried, not in pages but in soil, scent and silence. That discovery unlocked a flood of realizations. In the church guest book, Zara later found an entry dated years ago. Bilgremi. The same name signed in an old brittle letter in the judge's archive. That letter had contained only one cryptic line.
"I'm coming back."
To reclaim what was mine, or at least the memory of it. Everything now began to stitch together with chilling clarity. Farida Bukhari wasn't who she claimed to be. She was Aliya Bilgremi, Judge Bilgremi's long-lost wife, the woman everyone believed had either eloped or died under dubious circumstances. She had returned, not as a ghost, not to haunt, but to quietly, deliberately reclaim the home that once belonged to her. She came not with lawyers or fury, but with a smile, a silver locket, and jasmine that bloomed where only her hands touched the soil. Every time she rearranged a piece of furniture, every glance she gave the hallway corners, every door she opened without hesitation, it all spoke of a familiarity not learned, but remembered. Perhaps the judge had known. Perhaps that's why, in his final days, he stopped receiving visitors altogether. Not out of fear, but out of recognition, or shame. The kind of shame respectable society buries quietly under rituals and silence. Maybe it wasn't rage or madness that took Aliya's life all those years ago, but the slow poison of respectability, the desperate urge to protect names, legacies, and reputations. And now Zara, holding her diary with trembling fingers, wrote down a date, not to expose a scandal, but to mark the moment when the past returned as perfume in the air, and petals in the soil. The truth no longer whispered. It bloomed. She always reached with her left, an unconscious motion so fluid it betrayed years of instinct rather than momentary choice. The way she poured the tea, folded her gloves, touched the lace curtain with absent fingers. Every motion hummed with a quiet rhythm learned long ago. When the tray was set to her left, it wasn't kindness. It was memory masquerading as courtesy, and the one who placed it there had known her not casually, but intimately, perhaps in another name, another life, long before the world remembered or forgot. But it was the sundial that disturbed Miss Kiran the most. A curious relic positioned not for beauty but once, clearly, for purpose, erected in the rear garden behind the kitchen. Aligned not with the house but with a worn iron bench nestled beneath tangled rosa vines, its stone legs rooted in the very soil, where shadows came to rest in late afternoon. The dial was long neglected, moss-kissed and rust-streaked, all except for the blade. The gnomon, freshly polished, its dullness scrubbed away with the care of someone who needed precision, not nostalgia. Why polish only the blade, if the timepiece itself had become obsolete? Unless the shadow mattered again, not for marking hours, but for something darker. The angle of light, the moment when a shadow fell precisely across a lap or a cup, when the sun was just warm enough to dissolve a bitter trace into sweetness. Miss Kiran understood then. Poison administered in trace amounts required patience, timing. Trust and timing came from light. The tea had always arrived the same way, during that tranquil hour when the house exhaled, when conversation dulled and reflection reigned. And the hand that served it was steady, familiar, not threatening, perhaps even comforting, as all betrayals tend to be. Miss Alina Harcourt had accepted that hand, not because she forgot the past, but because the woman before her had cloaked herself in the fabric of family. Same tilt of the head, same almond scent of rosewater and clove, the same old nursery rhyme hummed absently at dusk. But who was she really? Not Mrs. Denham, certainly. A name borrowed like a coat too large, and never quite fitting. A deeper history began to surface. Childhood photos tucked in the attic. Two girls with the same eyes, one always standing slightly behind the other. Letters burned at the edges, initials interwoven like vines. They hadn't merely crossed paths, they'd once shared paths, diverged in shadow, and now rejoined in silence. So when Alina returned to claim her name, her home, her place at the table, there had been no grand declarations, only a gentle conversation and a teacup passed with a whisper. It was not rage that poisoned her. It was longing, buried so deep it fermented into something deadly. And now, on a crisp morning, scented with lemon polish and something softer, older jasmine, perhaps Miss Kiran set out the heirloom china, not for ceremony, but for revelation. The parlor felt still, as if holding its breath. Mrs. Denham sat upright, her smile unflinching, while old Mr. Lyle stirred his tea without sipping. And young Amira looked everywhere but at the silver locket now resting quietly on a velvet tray. Miss Kiran spoke gently, her words pruning the silence like a gardener before bloom. When one traces the shadow, she began, one often finds not darkness, but the shape of what was lost. No one interrupted. There were no accusations, only the soft collapse of carefully stacked lies. The tray, the timing, the left hand that reached once and never again. It hadn't been a crime of chaos, but of choreography. And in the center of it all, not a villain, but a woman who had once loved and been erased, now returning as memory wrapped in lace, with poison steeped in tea, and a shadow falling finally, in just the right place. The scent of lavender, and something faintly metallic hung in the air of the old Hawthorne estate, particularly near the west corridor, where the shutters had remained closed for decades, save for the occasional visitor, who claimed they were drawn by the ivy-covered fountain outside. Miss Langley stood near the arched window, eyes narrowed, her voice scarcely louder than the ticking clock in the drawing room. She didn't vanish. She said more to herself than to anyone else. She was erased. No one responded. Not Mrs. Whitcomb, seated rigidly by the cold fireplace, nor the inspector, whose notebook remained unopened. The name Annalise Calderwood hadn't been spoken in Hawthorne since the summer of 1929, when she disappeared without luggage, witness, or word. But the silver thimble found in the sewing nook, long untouched save for the recent dusting, matched the one seen in the only surviving photograph. It wasn't proof, not in the strictest sense, but it opened a door that had remained bolted by silence. Miss Langley's tone softened, but her gaze did not. She came back, didn't she? Quietly, not to cause harm, but to reclaim her name. Mrs. Whitcomb did not deny it, nor did she confirm. Her fingers twitched slightly over the porcelain teacup, untouched and long gone cold. A rustle, not of leaves, but of memory, passed through the room, and the air felt suddenly heavier. Miss Langley spoke again, her words slow, deliberate. But you couldn't let her speak. You knew if she told even part of what happened, the life you'd built would unravel thread by thread. So you silenced her, not with violence, but with civility. A nightcap, a promise, a sleep from which she simply didn't not wake. Still no one moved. The silence thickened, not with tension, but with acceptance, the kind that arrives when truth long denied floats to the surface not with a scream, but with the soft finality of a held breath. Mrs. Whitcomb finally looked up, her voice barely audible. I thought she'd stay gone. We all did. But she remembered the roses. And indeed, it was the yellow rose pressed inside the drawer, one that hadn't bloomed in the estate garden since the Calderwoods, that told the story no words had. The west corridor had been sealed after her return. Her room left untouched, her journals hidden beneath floorboards, spoke in looping cursive of regret, exile, and a single sentence repeated often. I only wanted to be seen. Miss Langley did not accuse. She only stood quietly and said, being inconvenient should never have been a death sentence. And in that moment the wind changed, no longer carrying lavender, but something sourer, older. The law would follow its course in due time, yet no one in Hawthorne truly expected it to. Justice, after all, wears many masks, and in this village it sometimes resembled a bowed head, a key returned to a forgotten door, and the quiet decision to never again prune the roses that grew behind the west corridor. In the weeks to come the townsfolk resumed their quiet routines. The baker resumed her disputes with the chimney sweep. The bells chimed at noon with unfailing loyalty, and though the name Annalise Calderwood was whispered in corners, it was never mentioned outright. But Miss Langley knew better. She knew that peace does not come from silence, only the illusion of it, and some ghosts do not rest beneath gravestones. They linger in corridors, waiting not to be mourned, but acknowledged. The villagers of Elmsworth had always known how to walk around the truth, to tiptoe past the echoes of what should never be spoken aloud, selective amnesia cloaked in civility. When the scandal at Ashmere Hollow finally slipped into public knowledge, it was digested not with outrage, but with the quiet discernment of a community well practiced in folding uncomfortable truths into the creases of daily life. Mrs. Thorne returned to her ivy-choked cottage on the edge of the lane, where the garden had become wild in her absence. Roses snarled with creeping bindweed, the earth cracked from neglect, yet still oddly alive. With each tug of root and flick of her trowel, she did not dwell on blame or justice, but on a more insidious affliction, the kind of fear that does not scream but settles softly into the marrow. A fear of stirring what has long been buried, not because it threatens safety, but because it might awaken memory. It was not danger they had feared, she realized, but confrontation, the kind that tears open the stitched seams of collective forgetting. The garden, however, did not care. The bees returned undeterred by disgrace, and the rosemary thrived, indifferent to human shame. People, she thought, rarely commit cruelty with wicked intent. They clutch their deceptions as shields, desperate to maintain the version of themselves the world has allowed them to become. Mrs. Thorne thought of Annabel Mercer, or whoever she had once been, a woman who had worn her borrowed identity like armor until the weight of it dragged her under. Not malevolent, just terrified. A soul who had gambled that silence might spare her the cost of truth. Somewhere across the lane, a blackbird trilled from the hedgerow, and the setting sun lengthened shadows like outstretched fingers across the lawn. Mrs. Thorne stood slowly, her skirt dusted in soil, the ache in her back reminding her that time moves whether one wants it to or not. Ashmere would heal, it always did, but deep beneath its trimmed hedges and well-rehearsed smiles, the unearthed memory of that long-forgotten night would hum like a root system no one dared dig up again. Young Elliot Wren, the boy who had found the cellar door half buried behind the crumbling greenhouse, had spoken little since, but his silence was not shame, it was understanding. His father had scolded him for trespassing, made him write an apology to the groundskeeper, but Elliot had written it with the stiffness of someone who knew he had done something both forbidden and necessary. Mrs. Thorne, who knew how finely drawn the line was between mischief and insight, had sent him a note. her handwriting looping delicately across ivory paper. Dear Elliot, sometimes it takes young eyes to see what age has forgotten. Never stop looking where others avert their gaze. Alongside it she'd placed a thin book wrapped in brown paper, The Hollow Watcher, an old story she had cherished as a child, full of rustling woods, misplaced clues, and children who noticed what adults ignored. It was said he'd read it 3 times in as many days, and now kept it in the drawer beside his bed, dog-eared and fiercely guarded. Mrs. Thorne smiled when she heard, because she knew the world often trained children to dismiss what unsettled them, to silence the instinct that tugged at their sleeves when something was amiss. But truth, she believed, did not always shout. It sometimes knocked gently, waiting for the one who dared to answer. And this story, too, had not begun with confrontation or confession. It had begun, as many truths do, with a faint sound. A tap, a scrape, a hollow echo from beneath the floorboards, and a boy brave enough to stop and listen. As the evening stretched itself into twilight, the world outside seemed to soften, as if time itself were holding its breath, suspended in a moment too quiet to be real. The air, once filled with the vibrant sounds of birds and rustling leaves, had fallen still like the calm before a storm that no one could predict. Mrs. Amelia Whitmore sat in her dimly lit study, the dim light from the window casting long shadows on the walls, her eyes fixed on the final card that lay before her. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface, tracing the edges of the envelope, its contents written but never spoken. It wasn't the first time she had written such words, words that were meant to bring closure, to release a truth that had been hidden for far too long. But there was something different this time. There was no escape, no way to undo what had been set in motion. The kettle on the stove whistled gently, its sound almost an intrusion in the suffocating silence of the room. Outside, the garden had settled into shadow, the last vestiges of sunlight catching only the tips of the roses, casting an ethereal glow that seemed too delicate to last. Mrs. Whitmore poured herself a cup of tea, her hand shaking only slightly, as the steam rose from the cup, filling the room with the warmth of familiarity. She stirred it absently, her mind elsewhere, caught in the thought of the card she had just placed on the sill. The envelope was simple, unmarked, unaddressed, but it had a weight to it that seemed far heavier than its size. It had not yet been sent, but in the stillness of that moment, it was as if the card had already spoken. Perhaps it had already done what it was meant to do, even without being read. Mrs. Whitmore glanced at it again, and the memory of that small knock, a sound so faint that no one else had heard it, lingered in her mind. It was a knock that had opened a door to a past that had been shut for far too long, a door no one had dared to open for fear of what it might reveal. A door that, once opened, had led to more than just the truth. It had led to a reckoning. The locket, the photographs, the letters, none of it had mattered anymore. Those were simply the remnants of a story that had begun long before Mrs. Whitmore had entered the picture. But what haunted her was not the artifacts of the past. No, it was the scent. It was the faint, lingering scent of rosewater and jasmine that seemed to have pressed itself into the very fabric of the house, seeping into the upholstery of the old armchairs, mingling with the air, as though it had never truly gone. It was a scent she had tried to ignore, one that followed her like a shadow, no matter how many years had passed since it had first appeared. It was not the scent of crime, for crime had long since faded into the dust of forgotten time. Nor was it guilt, which had long left with the woman who had once held it close, like a secret too heavy to bear. It was not scandal either, for scandal never lasted long in a place like St. Mary, where secrets were buried in the hedges, and only the brave or the foolish dared to dig them up. No, this scent was different. It was something more intimate, more insidious. It was a combination of jasmine, a flower that held so much history and memory, and rosewater, a fragrance that spoke of times long past, of a softness now lost. It lingered, like a memory too painful to forget, too quiet to fully confront, and it had followed her, followed them, all these years. Mrs. Whitmore had come to understand that scents were not just ephemeral things that clung to the air. They were markers of time, of moments too delicate to be caught in words. They held memories, both the cherished and the broken, and they held them in a way that no photograph or letter ever could. And the scent of jasmine and rosewater, so faint but so persistent, had become a symbol of a story that refused to be told, a truth that had been hidden too well for too long. She placed the sprig of jasmine on her writing desk, not out of sentiment, but as a reminder that even the most well-meaning secrecy, when left unchecked, could grow into something far more dangerous. That even the smallest of fears, when left unspoken, could quietly spread like ivy, creeping into the dark corners of a life, until it had rooted itself so deeply that there was no way to tear it out. The truth had never been loud. It had not arrived in a flash of dramatic revelation, or in a courtroom full of accusations. No, the truth had come quietly, like a soft tide that rose and fell without warning, without anyone realizing it was happening, until it had already swept through the village, leaving nothing behind but the quiet certainty of what had been. Mrs. Whitmore had thought that justice would come with a name, with a confession, with a loud pronouncement of guilt. But justice had come in its own way, through understanding, through the quiet return of a name once spoken only in whispers: Eleanor Hartley. The confession, the punishment, the trial, none of it mattered as much as the telling. The acknowledgement of a life once lost, a life now remembered. And in that remembering, there was peace. Not the kind of peace that was born of resolution, but the kind that came from acceptance of the past, acceptance of what had been done, and acceptance of what had been left unsaid. As Mrs. Whitmore sealed the letter with wax, an old-fashioned gesture that felt like a small tribute to a time that had passed, the evening breeze fluttered through the open window, lifting the edges of her notepaper. The scent of jasmine filled the room once more, as if the garden itself were sending her a final message. She closed her eyes briefly, a silent prayer for the woman whose story had never truly been hers to tell. The roses would bloom again next spring, she knew. The locket would tarnish, its delicate beauty fading into the shadows of the past. The sundial would turn, as it always had, without a witness. But Eleanor's story, Eleanor's truth would never disappear. Not while the scent of jasmine lingered in the air, faint but undeniable. Somewhere, in a village where doors had once remained locked, one had finally opened, and through it had passed not only the truth, but the memories of a life once lived and then lost. And as the evening deepened, and the village returned to its quiet routine, Mrs. Whitmore knew that the roses would bloom, the locket would tarnish, but Eleanor's story would never vanish. It would live on, in the faintest trace of jasmine that still clung to the air, a quiet echo of a life, of a secret that had taken far too long to be told.